So, Mas Ricky, we will start, ya?
Ya.
Okay. Okay, good morning. And Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. To all FOSI committee and all of participants, welcome back to FOSI Talk from Home series. I'm Melinda speaking here. It's my pleasure on behalf of FOSI committee to welcome you here this morning. For those who's fasting today, happy fasting for you all. May God accept our ibadah in this blessed month. We are in many different time zones, 8 p.m. in Henry's time at Houston now. So therefore, thank you very much for sparing your time today, spending your weekend for this talk. Thank you in registering FOSI online talk via Zoom webinar on the application of seismic stratigraphy and seismic geomorphology to sequence stratigraphy and sedimentology. Very excited to share with you that the registered participants reach beyond the limit. Around 600 participants will joining us soon. I would like to extend my gratitude to our sponsor, Nobel Energy Resources and Geoscience Delta Andalan for funding this Zoom platform. Amid this COVID-19 outbreak situation, hope everybody doing well, stay at home and keep social distancing. I will introduce FOSI committee attending today's meeting. Mas Ricky, hi Mas Ricky, and then Pak Win, and then the rest will joining us soon. We are honored to have Henry Posamentier today. Some of you, I believe, already know him very well, but let me share with you his summary briefly. So Henry Posamentier is a consultant now, Posamentier Geoscience LLC USA. Take a PhD in Syracuse University Department of Geology. He started his experience in company from Exxon 1979, and then Arco, Anadarko, Chevron, and being a consultant since 2014 until now. He is well known in sequence stratigraphy, seismic stratigraphy, and seismic geomorphology. So let me share with you a bit about his presentation today. He will talk about the integrating analysis. Plan view and section view images can significantly enhance prediction of the spatial and temporal distribution of subsurface lithology, compartmentalization and stratigraphy trapping capabilities, as well as enhanced understanding of process sedimentology and sequence stratigraphy. Detailed analysis of the 3D seismic data have allowed refinement of sequence stratigraphic models by clearly revealing the presence of depositional environment, the depositional elements, and seeing the evolution of landscape through time. This presentation will focus in particular on deep water systems and highlight aspects of sequence stratigraphy and sedimentology the study of 3D seismic image can reveal. So before I hand over to Henry, please allow me to give you some rules in order to make this meeting running smoothly. I would like to get your attention for a moment. First, I recommend to all participants to mute the audio and switch off your video during explanation from presenter to maintain good connection. Second, the presentation may be recorded for rescreening within the FOSI platforms. Third, a question and answer box can be found in the icon panels, usually at the bottom of your screen. Enter your name or your questions for the committee to collate for after the presentation. It will be answered live by Henry later on. And you might turn on your audio or your video to deliver your questions. Last but not least, the presentation is open for public, so you can get the copy from FOSI later on. So hope everybody happy with that. So well, to all participants, enjoy your time on the talk. Without any further ado, please welcome Henry Posamentier to deliver the presentation. Yes, Henry, please, it's your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Melinda. It's an interesting time. I wish I was in Jakarta, but we'll do what we can from a distance, and life goes on. So what I'm going to share with you today is some aspects of seismic stratigraphy with applications to deep water seismic stratigraphy, seismic geomorphology. And what I've done is condense a week-long course into 1.5 or 1 hour. So we're going to cover a lot of ground, but not deeply enough, but just to give you a flavor for this subject. So let's go into this. So this is the outline of my presentation. Let's see if I can minimize that. Yep. So what we're going to do first, the presentation will be in 3 parts. First, we'll talk a little bit about the principles of seismic stratigraphy and seismic geomorphology. And by the way, what you're looking at on the left-hand side is an image of a deep water turbidite system with a principal feeder channel opening up into a large fan over here. And we can see on the side here, there's been the flow broke through the levee and produced a crevasse splay over here. So right away, what you see is a very clear image of the geomorphology. So geomorphology is the study of landforms. And what you see here is very much a paleo landscape from the Triassic. And you see a lot of detail. Now, the challenge that the geologist faces is twofold. First, you have to have good techniques to extract these images. So the next step is the workflows and techniques that that we use to get images like this. But once you have those images, that's the first step. The second step, and arguably the more important step, is how do you populate that picture with the correct and appropriate lithology. And that, of course, is where value is added to the exploration and development process. So once we've talked about the principles and we've discussed workflows and techniques, that's when we'll begin to dive down and apply what we can learn from 3D seismic to sequence stratigraphy and sedimentology, and we'll focus on deep water. So first, let's start off discussing some general principles of seismic stratigraphy and seismic geomorphology. Now, in the old days, and we can talk about classical seismic stratigraphy, in the old days, we had 2D sections. We didn't have 3D volumes. That came quite a bit later. But in the 1960s and 1970s, it became clear that what we could see on seismic data was stratigraphic architecture. And specifically, we would look for onlapping relationships, and you can see these reflections here, onlapping, this more bright reflection. There's a reflection onlap there, another one there. And we would see downlap as well. Sometimes we see toplap, erosional truncation. Each of these characteristics has stratigraphic significance, and of course also lithologic significance. So this was the early days, 2D based. So you take a seismic section like this, and you look for reflection terminations, whether it's toplap or downlap, and you characterize these depositional depositional units. In this case, we call it a depositional sequence that's bounded by stratigraphic discontinuity above as well as below. And so in the early days, this is how we pulled geologic information from seismic data. And again, in these early days, we'd have a loose 2D grid. This particular grid comes from the North Sea. And we had a grid of seismic. We have scattered wells. And based on the observations from these 2D lines, the interpreters would create maps and try to recreate the geomorphology. And essentially, this was an early attempt at seismic geomorphology, or geomorphology based on seismic analysis. Now, it was very rough. It was very imprecise, but it was a first attempt at using seismic data to generate a paleo landscape. Now, of course, in the 2000s, we have 3D seismic data. In this example, we're looking at a significant unconformity characterized by reflection terminations that separates the Cretaceous from the Devonian, millions of years right in here. And when you look at just the section view, you're essentially evaluating the stratigraphy. And from the section view, we can see that there's a significant break in the succession. But we don't have much detail about the paleogeography on that surface until we bring 3D seismic into the picture. And what you see in the lower image, a structure map of that surface. And you can see paleo drainage very clearly. You can see a highland plateau on the right. You can see a lowland area on the left with numerous small channels. Now, what's also very, very important is context. So context is the background information we have about this area. I know from context, from the literature, that all of this is carbonates. And above this unconformity, it's all clastics. So these carbonates here, at the time these valleys were active, these carbonates were in a highland area. So we would presume that the water table at this time was lower and in this highland area than it would have been down here. And so we would expect karsting, dissolution of carbonates, more common up here than down here. So there's a lot of information that we can derive from this lovely picture right here. So now, of course, when we talk about 3D seismic, we're looking at cubes of data where we can cut the data any way we want to generate a section view in any orientation we choose. And we can also look at 2D data. And ultimately, what we're looking for are stratigraphically significant patterns. And that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing a section view, which is the stratigraphy, and you're looking at a map view, which is the geomorphology. Both of these pictures give us important information that we can factor in to our understanding of lithology, because ultimately, that's what we want to predict. We want to predict where there's sand. We want to predict where there's shale. We want to predict are there compartments that we need to think about as we develop an exploitation strategy. So let me now show you some workflows and techniques. And we'll start off by listing many different workflows. And this, of course, is much more than I can cover in an hour. So what I'm going to do is focus on a few of these. And so I'm not going to go through this list systematically, but nonetheless, these are many of the workflows and techniques that are designed to help us pull information, geologic information, from the seismic volume. But at the end of the day, it's all about pattern recognition. We see a pattern, and then it's our job to move next level and predict lithology. In this picture, we're looking at a fluvial system, a river system, a Pleistocene river system in the Gulf of Thailand. And what we can see is a nice sinuous pattern, like so. We can see the last position of the channel. That's the actual final position of the river. It's about 150 to 200 meters wide. We can see point bar deposits. We can see abandoned meander loops. We can also see these very subtle lineaments here. What these lineaments are indications of tidal processes. This particular river is pretty close to the ocean, pretty close to the end of the river system, so that we're seeing tides come in and out. So actually sea level is rising and falling twice a day with the tide. And every time it goes up, it floods the point bar. Every time the water level goes down, when the tide goes down, low tide, then the water drains off the point bar and develops these drainage lines. So what it tells me is that the material, the lithology of this point bar deposit, these point bar deposits, is going to be variable with some sand and some mud. So it's more heterolithic than a true fluvial deposit. So it's giving me insight to lithology. So it's all about recognizing the pattern. And then, very importantly, how do we populate the patterns that we observe? So the key is to apply geologic concepts to the patterns that we see. So to do these analyses correctly, you have to be partly a geophysicist to understand the geophysical data, and certainly partly a geologist so that you can apply your geologic principles to the patterns that you see. So now let me show you some of these workflows. And I've picked off a few that are a little bit different. So we're going to look at creative datuming. Now, we all know, if you've worked seismic data, that picking a horizon and shifting the horizon up and down and doing what we call horizon slicing is a very common technique. And it really works well if you have horizons that are easy to pick that you can then quickly shift up and down. But what if you don't have a clear horizon to pick, or you want to do something, you want to create a slice very quickly without having to carefully pick every line or every fifth line? So in this example, we're looking at a time slice through a seismic volume, and what we see right in here, and let me blow that up a little bit, you can see this pattern right in here that looks like it's got a lot of small channels in it. And I've blown it up in this picture here. So that's my interval of interest, or my pattern of interest. Now, when I look at this pattern, the context is deep water. We're in a deep water environment. So this is not fluvial. This is deep water. It's not carbonates. So the context tells me the rules that apply are those rules that are relevant to deep water settings. So here I have all of these channels. And I know from deep water settings, that's a pretty sand-prone interval, with sand in the channel and sand between the channels. But I want to image the whole landscape. And the time slice, as you can see, only captures one band or one narrow stretch. So what does this look like in section view? Well, it's right here. And it's not particularly distinctive. It's not, you look at it and you say, well, I can see discontinuous reflections, but it doesn't look very interesting. However, when you look at the slice, and we've sliced right through here, so this part right there is this part right here. And you can see very clearly that there are interesting features that we see in map view, which in section view are not so obvious. So what we can see as humans is much easier to interpret from the plan view than the section view. So we're much more comfortable making an interpretation of multiple channels here than we are making an interpretation of multiple channels here, even if it's the same the same body of rock. Here it's clear, here not so much. So the way to do this quickly, very, very quickly, and one of the things you learn through the years is that we, in this business, very often we're given data and we're asked to be very fast in our interpretations. So yeah, I could interpret every line, every slice, one by one by one. It's very inefficient. What I'll show you is a very quick technique for imaging the paleo landscape. So what I've done here is taken a slice and I've interpreted a horizon. I've made a pick on that surface. And then I slice down. Now, as I slice down, watch how this band gradually shifts to the right. And I'm going to keep picking on the left-hand side of this channel belt. As I go down and down, you can see I'm still picking on the left-hand side and down again and down again, going about 30 milliseconds with each slice, 25, 30 milliseconds. But each time I'm picking right at the edge of this field or that pattern, and again, and again, and again. So at the end of this process, if we look at what we've done, we've created a very loose grid by slicing and picking on that surface. So now, very clearly, all I have to do is interpolate like that, and I've got a horizon. And if I look at the structure, you can see this is dipping down this way. Now I can take amplitude and drape it onto that horizon. And if we look at the actual horizon that we picked just now, that's what it is. And let's blow it up a bit. You can see that the input point for all these channels is predominantly from the south and the southwest. So most of these channels are coming in this way. There are some also coming in from the left. If we now go up 20 milliseconds, we can see still that we're inputting from the south, but now we're getting more and more input from the west. And if we go up to 40 milliseconds above the original pick and look at an amplitude extraction here, this southerly source is now getting smaller, and this source is dominating. And finally, 60 milliseconds above, almost everything is coming from the west. So the process that I've just described of creative datuming, it's creative datuming because we're not actually snapping to a horizon. We're being very loose about how we make these picks, but in the space of the time it took to do this was probably 5 minutes. So in 5 minutes, I've got a pretty good feel for the geology. So let me show you another example. So here we're looking at an interesting feature right there. And when we look at it more closely, we have these high amplitudes, there's a bit of a bump above it, and again, the context. Again, deep water. This time it's a slope environment. And when I see these kinds of amplitudes in a slope setting, I'm thinking that's probably a slope valley with turbidites. And you can't really see the container that clearly, but that's the base of this valley or channel. And it's filled with these high amplitude reflections. There's a bit of a bump above here. And the bump is usually a good thing because it's telling you that whatever's filling that valley is not as compactable as what's out here. And that's usually sand. So we refer to that phenomenon as differential compaction. More compaction here because it's fine grained, less compaction here because it's coarse grained. So let's see how we can very quickly, and literally this takes minutes. All you do is very quickly, you look at one line this way, make your pick, and then you tie all these others at a spacing of maybe 30 or 40 lines separated. Then you interpolate that, and then you do an amplitude extraction on that interpolated pick, and this is what you end up with. You can see the slope valley coming down like this. We don't see hardly any individual channels. If you look at that really carefully, you can see maybe individual channels in here that populate the slope valley as it comes down. But this is a very sand-prone feature, and it's about 3 kilometers wide. We can also look at the same feature using what we call an optical stack. And I'll show you that a little bit later, but what this involves is instead of looking at a slice, we're looking at a section of about 100 milliseconds and allowing if it's a black and white color palette, we're making the black transparent and all we're seeing is the white. It's like an X-ray of that 100 milliseconds or a CAT scan of the 100 millisecond interval. It's similar to an RMS for those of you who are geophysically oriented. And I'll show you how that works in a moment. So we looked at creative datuming. Let's look at multi-horizon flattening. So here's an example of a carbonate system with a big carbonate buildup here, which you go off into the basin where it's fine grain calcareous mudstone or marl off to the side, and a big carbonate buildup here. And there's that differential compaction effect. This compacts less than that, so you get this bump over the top. So what you like to do to recreate the paleogeography is identify or section through this profile with surfaces like this, because that's the way it grew. So these would be indications of this. Looking at these surfaces would be like looking at going in a time machine, going back in time. So the reef looked like this earlier, and still earlier like that, and then finally down here, that's where it all began. So here's a seismic section that is the real world. Before you saw a cartoon. That's our buildup. And what we really want are timelines through there. So the timeline goes through the buildup, and of course also through the basinal fine grain material here. These are the carbonate buildups. This is the coeval marl. So, and notice down below there are small scale buildups down below, and then so the style of carbonate growth was very different in this Kujung 2 versus Kujung 1. So normally what you do is you pick a horizon at the base and flatten on it. And that's what we did right there. So this is the usual. So what we're trying to do is restore the buildup back to its original state by flattening on the base, because presumably the base was pretty flat. But notice by flattening here, I've created an artifact. So that doesn't exist before I flattened it. But once I flattened it, I pull that down, and that's not good, as you'll see in a moment. What I really want to do is flatten on the top, which is this dark reflection here, and flatten on the base simultaneously. So that's what I've done here. And to do that, of course, this part and this part really need to get stretched so that we can allow those two horizons to be parallel. But once I've done this, then I can slice through here and get a meaningful paleogeography through time. So I can slice here and here and here. So here's the original section again. You can see these Kujung 2 small buildups down below. You can see the base of the Kujung 1 over here. And when you come off the reef over here, it all drops down, because this section here and that section there are slower. They're acoustically or seismically slow. So in this time data, we get this drop down. So we call this a velocity pull-up. And there's some very interesting features that we won't have time to get into. But notice right at the top of this guy, of Kujung 1 reef, you see these small pimples on here. That's typical of the last stage of carbonate buildup. Also notice this fault over here. That's also very typical of the fact that this is all compacting and shearing over here. So if you slice, just take a simple time slice, you get these pictures. They're not very satisfying as a paleogeographic map. If you look at section B down here, we're going through these Kujung 2 small patch reefs. You can see them all here, but then you come off on the sides and you're up in here. And so you're really not getting a good paleogeography. Likewise, if you slice through here, you're going through the reef, but then you're also going through this much younger section on the sides. So that's also not that satisfying. If you flatten on the base, as I showed you before, and then slice up in here, notice you've created these holes over here. And it looks like you've got, if I wasn't thinking about what I've done, I've created a paleogeography that's not real. It looks like an atoll or one of these circular islands with a lagoon in the middle, but that's only because I flattened on the base and created that artifact. If I slice down lower, I don't have any problems. This looks like a good paleogeography with lots and lots of little Kujung II patch reefs that populated this earlier time. The best way to image this section is to flatten on the top and the bottom. So multi-horizon flattening, or in this case, 2 horizons that we're flattening on. So that's how so now we can slice at the top and the bottom, and this gives us a nice picture at the base and also a nice picture of what it looked like at the time of deposition. This is truly a timeline through the section. And notice how this section on the sides had to be stretched. And essentially, you look at the data here, and let me blow that up again. If you look at the reef proper, and if I were to look at the frequency content in here and compare it with the frequency content here, here we have maybe 10 reflections. Here we have 3. So much lower frequency by stretching it. So it simulates, it's a proxy for sedimentation rate. Low frequency, low sedimentation rate. High frequency, high sedimentation rate, relatively speaking. So there's value to just to doing this stretching business. And then we can also do the same thing that we did here with the stretching by proportionately slicing through the section. The same result is achieved by proportional slicing or by multi-horizon flattening. And here's an example of that Kujung buildup, and I've just done a cutaway so you can see there's the Kujung 1, and here it's been stretched to make it so that we can now just slice horizontally. Finally, the workflow called optical stacking. So here's an example of a very faulted section in the Miocene of the Gulf of Thailand. You can see all the faults through here, and here and there you see pieces of channels in the coming through. You can see these pieces of channels. They don't seem to go anywhere, but there are many, many indications. In this case, the context is fluvial. And right there is an interesting amplitude that you can see right there. It's right here. And it's actually part of a bigger system, but it's not apparent from this image. So this is 1 kilometer for scale down here, so you know how much area this is covering. If we look at an interval now, and we make the interval completely transparent, looking from above, completely transparent except for the whites. And now it's like looking at an X-ray. Now you can see this entire channel system coming across the area. You can even see places where there's a confluence or two channels coming together. So looking at them side by side, you can see the value of doing an optical stack versus a time slice. And looking at it in detail, this is just a detail of the optical stack. Now we can see complete channel belts making their way across the paleo landscape. The faults are still there, but they're much less apparent. So now let's apply some of these workflows to deep water settings. So in the deep water, sedimentation is dominated. So just let me set the context for you. So we're in deep water, and in deep water, sediment is delivered several ways. First of all, and probably most interesting to us, are sediment gravity flows, and specifically turbidites. So sediment gravity flow is kind of an umbrella term that includes not only turbidites, but also mass transport. We are, normally we're looking for turbidite deposits. Mass transport, for many reasons, are not a good reservoir target. So turbidites are what we're after. But we also get hemipelagic and pelagic deposits. They just get layered. This is the drape. This is the sediment. This is the material that falls out of the water column very gently, usually very fine grained. And finally, the other big player in deep water are contour current deposits. Also, normally, these are fine grained with a few exceptions here and there. But normally, these are the ones that are sand prone. And that's the ones that we're going to focus on. It's that type of deposit that we'll focus on in this over the next half hour. So, sequence stratigraphy. Well, sequence stratigraphy, what it's built around is the fact that when you look at stratigraphic successions, they tend to be cycles. So we have cycles of sedimentation, and those cycles of sedimentation have been related to fluctuations of sea level. Sea level goes up, sea level goes down, up and down, and as sea level goes up and down, certain things happen. And we're going to focus on the response of deep water settings to variations in sea level. So here I've just drawn a cartoon, a hypothetical situation of sea level high stand. So it's kind of like today, where sea level is high. And in most of the continental margins around the world, the depot center, or where rivers are delivering sediment, the depot centers are located on the inner to middle shelf, kind of like in this illustration. So rivers are delivering sediment to this depot center, and that depot center is not close enough to the shelf edge for these sediments to be delivered into the deep water. So in most settings, the deep water is quiet today. It's not very active. So we're not getting active delivery by rivers right to the shelf edge. I mean, you can look in your area, if you look at the Mahakam Delta, the sediments delivered by the Mahakam River do not reach the shelf edge. They're delivered to the middle shelf. And so the deep water in the Makassar Strait is pretty quiet. It's just seeing very slow rain of just the fallout from a very fine grained material that produces a very layered, very fine grained deposit in the deep water. So this is high stand time. Now, let's lower sea level. The depot center is pushed to the shelf edge. And now we're delivering sediment right to the place, right to the top of the slope or outer shelf. Now, when you deliver sediment here, it's not so difficult to further move that sediment down into the deep water by gravity. So we get gravity flows, and we get sedimentation in the deep water. And that's what we call low stand time. Now, it's important to understand that like any event, whether it's coronavirus or turbidity currents, it has a beginning and it has an end. And the beginning ramps up and becomes more and more dominant, and the end, everything tapers off, which is hopefully the way the virus will go. Well, it's the same with turbidite, the turbidite world. It ramps up and becomes progressively bigger, more and more active, and then it tapers off as sea level resumes its rise. Depot center moves back across, away from the shelf edge. The turbidite systems go slowly to sleep. So, but what happens early is different from what happens late, because in the early stages, we're getting bigger and bigger flows. In the late stages, we're getting smaller and smaller flows. So predictable changes in depositional style occur as low stand time begins and then ends. So let's look at a shelf margin. This is from the Gulf of Mexico. And what you're seeing is the shelf edge right there. And that's right here. And we can see on the slope, there's a big channel coming down. And this profile, which is AB down here, shows that it's a nice levied channel right there. And then if we turn the corner and look at BC, what you can see is that there's a shelf edge delta that's of the same age as this channel. And so that's the shelf edge delta here. Now let's look at that in some more detail. There's our shelf edge delta. That's the base of these deposits, which we can call a low stand deposit because it's at the shelf edge. It's not. It's only active when it was active when sea level was low. But if you look very carefully, we actually have a downstepping. Let me go back. You can see this progressive downstepping early, and then it kind of goes vertical over here. So we can talk about an early low stand where it's downstepping and a later low stand where it's just vertically aggrading. And look at the seaward extension of each of these slices. When it's downstepping, we get relatively thick deposits on these cliniforms. When it's vertically aggrading, this very quickly thins. The reason being that as you're raising sea level slowly, we're now causing more sediment to be deposited here at the expense of going farther out. When we were downstepping, there was no budget wasted on building up. It was just downstepping. Here we have to build up as well as out. In the early low stand, all we had to do was build out. So here you can start to see that there's a difference between what happens early in the low stand with what happens later in the low stand. And so let's look at this a little bit schematically. So time one would be high stand deposition out of the picture. It's like what we see today, where we have a lot of, where most of our depot centers are in the middle to inner shelf. Then we lower sea level and we push the depot center out to here. And again with 3, so 1 to 2 to 3. And then finally with 4, we raise sea level again. So this, all of the effects of sea level with respect to deep water deposits all comes back to what's happening right here. Down here, when you're in 3,000 meters of water, fluctuating sea level 100 meters really doesn't affect those systems directly. But because those deep water systems all start out and derive their sediment from up here, what happens here makes a big difference to what we ultimately see down there. So in a very general sense, this is what all turbidite systems look like, where we have the shelf over here, the slope over here, and the basin floor. So in the shelf area, that's where the flows begin. At the outer shelf, upper slope, the flows begin, and they start moving down the slope, and as they start moving, they accelerate. So there's accelerating flow. The flow becomes progressively more turbulent as it comes down here, and we start with this. Normally, there's a tendency to develop a tributive pattern. And you can see all these channels connecting. And then eventually you have a principal trunk or feeder channel. And as we go across the slope and down the basin floor, the flow gradually decelerates. And eventually the flow breaks out into a distributive pattern. And the flow is decelerating. If you think about it, this pattern is surprisingly similar to what we see in continental settings or fluvial settings. In continental settings, you go to the mountains and it's tributive. Then you cross the plains and you have single feeders. And then you hit the delta, which is distributive. And the whole system repeats itself again when you get to the deep water. These trunk or feeder channel systems, they can be as little as a few kilometers or as much as hundreds of kilometers. It all depends on how much slope you have, what's the relief of the slope, what's the gradient of the slope. It also depends largely on the sand to mud ratio of the flows, how big is the flow. All of that determines how far this will go before it opens up into a fan. So here's a quick overview where we have a canyon. We got the shelf, the slope, and the basin floor. And the way I've drawn this is to illustrate that you've got levees on both sides, but the levees really don't form until the flow can overtop the banks. So when the flow is initiated or starts at the head of the canyon, the flow is fully confined or constrained by canyon walls, and the canyon walls are higher than the top of the flow, as you can see from this cross section. And if you were able to analyze the flow itself, what you'd see is the sandiest part of the flow is near the base, and the muddier part of the flow is near the top. And that's natural. You figure you've got all this turbulence, and there's sand and mud and silt in the all mixed together. But because the sand is heavier, it tends to concentrate towards the base of the flow. So that's the sandiest part of the flow. And as we come down, the flow continues to come down and down. Finally, you get to the point where the top of the flow is able to get out of the channel. So that now the flow is not fully confined anymore. Some of it is escaping. Now notice what's escaping is not the sandy part of the flow, but the muddy part of the flow, which explains why levees are not a good reservoir target typically, because they are being supplied from the upper part of the turbidity current, which is naturally not as sand rich. And as it continues on, the levee height gradually gets lower and lower. And then finally, we get to here, and now the levees are so small that even the sandy part escapes the channel. So we get frequent avulsions down here. The channels constantly shift from place to place in this part of the world here. There's a transition, and that, which we call the transition point between channel constrained flows and unconstrained flows. And as you come farther down, the likelihood or possibility of getting crevasse splays increases because the levees are not so high anymore. It's easier to break through. So notice the overbanking here of sand-prone sediments. So now some examples. In this example, we're looking at a big system coming from the right towards the left. This seismic profile here is this blue line right there. And I constructed the blue line to follow pretty closely to the channel, but not hitting the channel itself, but very closely. So we're close to the top of the levee. And what you can see as you come down this profile is the levee height is getting lower and lower and lower and lower until finally about out here, it's impossible to see the levee at all. So going back to this picture, the levee height gets progressively lower as you get down system to the point where it's no longer, the levee is no longer able to fully constrain the flows. And that's where you break out into a fan. If we look at a series of profiles, starting with line 8 up in here, you can see the levees on both sides of the channel, classic textbook levees on both sides. And as we go from 8 to 6 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, to 2 rather, you can see the height of the levees is getting lower and lower. And finally at 2, it's barely recognizable where the levee is. And this is a natural phenomenon. So let's now look at some seismic expression of channels or channel complexes as we come down the system. And we group the channel or the channel style into what we call disorganized and organized. So organized means simply that there's a nice systematic pattern. You can see individual channel threads for a long distance. Disorganized, we see bits and pieces of channels. So let's kind of step back and look theoretically again. So we have a series of sea level highs and lows, highs and lows, highs and lows. And each time sea level falls, we get low stand time, we get a beginning, we get an end. And then we get flooding, and we get deposition of just fine grained, very thin deposits, which we call condensed section. And then again, low stand, high stand, low stand, high stand. So this is the cyclic nature of what we observe. Within an individual low stand, we can see gradually as we go into the low stand, we get progressively bigger flows, which I've shown here schematically. Each flow is a little bit bigger than the one that came before, bigger than the one that came before. As a result, with each flow being bigger than the one that came before, any deposits of this earlier one have a poor preservation potential. In other words, they get eroded by the bigger flows that follow. So this part of the cycle is dominated by erosion in the channel area, in that feeder channel area. Then, as sea level gradually rises, we get progressively smaller flows. So that part of the cycle is dominated by deposition. So we can see at early low stand time, we get cut, 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 because each flow is bigger than the one that came before. And now we move into late low stand time, where the flows are getting progressively smaller. That's when we tend to fill these channels. So now looking at patterns. So I've shown here 3 examples of disorganized patterns. Disorganized patterns are characterized by frequent avulsions, but the patterns are variable. Here we can see many channels that characterize this overall, this fan deposit here. In this example, we're looking at many channels, many pieces of channels that are more constrained. Here we're inboard of where ultimately you get fans. These are the feeder systems in a disorganized pattern. Here, it's another style of disorganized pattern where we have it looks more like a braided channel system. Many small channels characterize this overall larger channel fill. And finally, the organized one, where it's nice, and these are the ones you see in textbooks, beautiful channels, looks almost fluvial. So we're going to focus first on this organized pattern. Here's another example. If you look at a cross section, take away the size of the geomorphology, look at the stratigraphy, you can see what we would characterize as laterally shifting. So how does that happen, and why does that happen? Well, the first flow comes down, meanders down like so, it cuts. So the flow comes down, and the head of the flow cuts the seafloor, erodes the seafloor, makes a channel, and then as the body and the tail of the flow follow, we fill it. So one event produces a cut and fill process. However, in this particular organized scenario, the channel is never completely filled. So by the time the system comes alive again, the next flow comes down and follows pretty much the same path. It feels that channel. So it comes down, it shifts a little bit because there's erosion on the down system flank. And so you get this cut and fill over and over and over again. And that's what develops this nice systematic organized pattern. The key is that at the end of each flow, there's leftover accommodation or a shallow channel, which guides the next flow. So characteristics, mappable channels, systematic and similar channel patterns. And there's a tendency to not preserve the best facies because it's being eroded. So there's a tendency to preferentially preserve the off-axis and marginal facies. Not ideal. And so you can see the section view and the map view that characterizes an organized pattern. And we can see it's a very common pattern. And you can see from this example, the bump on top here, that's pretty sandy right there. This is pretty muddy off to the side. And again here, notice the bump. That's a good indication you've got sand. And in this one, you can see this very similar trajectory that where very commonly it moves horizontally and then it goes vertically towards the end. And I'm not going to get into the reasons why at this point, because that's subject for another lecture. So you can see the nice, beautiful pattern in map view, nice, beautiful pattern in section view. It looks very similar to river deposits. On the left-hand side is a river or fluvial deposit. On the right-hand side is a deep water turbidite. If I showed you that picture, those two pictures, and did not tell you which was which, it would be impossible to tell, almost impossible to recognize the difference. And when we look at the section view, the architecture looks very similar. The fill process is different. In river systems, it's about lateral accretion. In deep water, it's cut and fill, cut and fill, cut and fill. The ending architecture looks similar, but the internal architecture, which becomes important if you're developing an oil field, it's important to understand the architecture is not quite the same as it is with fluvial. So you have to be thinking a little differently. So how do we leverage this sort of thing? I'll show you a case study. This is the Black Sea. Turkey is down here, Georgia is to the right, Russia's on top. And we're looking at this area right here. And these big structures are sitting out here. And of course, they're exploration targets. So there are some key questions. So the targets are down in here, in the middle of these big folds. And there are multiple questions. Number one, are there reservoir-prone targets within the targeted interval? You know, are we going to find sand? And are the reservoir-prone deposits across the structures, or are they only in the low areas on either side? In other words, were the sands deposited before the folds or after? Finally, if the sediments are coming from the north, they come off the Siberian Shield, which is quartz rich. If they're coming from Georgia or from Turkey, they're going to be volcanic rich, and the reservoir quality then is much more challenged and much worse than the reservoir quality of sediments coming from the north. So those are the key questions. So the first image is an amplitude extraction on this reflection right here. Now notice we can't really get much information from the axis of the fold. So we always work in between where the data quality is good. And in this case, you can see already, you can see these big channels coming over the top, coming from inside. You know, apparently this structure did not exist at the time of deposition. The context here, important to understand, context here is deep water. We know that from outcrops nearby and from whatever limited drilling there's been in the Black Sea. So we've demonstrated, yes, there are reservoir deposits within the target interval down in here. We can see all these channels. And yes, the reservoir seems to go over the top of these structures. The structure came after the reservoir. So the last question is, were they coming out of the north or coming from the south? So to understand that, you look at a succession of slices. And what we did was slice systematically coming up through the section, as you can see here. And now we'll do that by looking straight down on it. And you can see all these channels. And the one we're going to follow is this one. There's a meander loop and another one. Watch how those two meander loops move with time. They're all systematically shifting to the south. And meander loop migration is your best indication of flow direction. So time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4. Clearly, meander loop migration was towards the south, flow direction was towards the south. So we've essentially answered the third question. Which way were the sediments coming from? At least within the area of our data coverage, it's pretty clear these were coming out of the north. Now let's look at the disorganized pattern. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is at the end of each flow, the channel was completely full. In other words, there was no leftover accommodation. The next flow comes along, and because there's a differential compactional bump, the next flow is going to come off to the side, and again, and again, and again. So each flow will avoid the one that came before it. So now we systematically preserve the axial facies, and in the map view, it's difficult to recognize one channel coming all the way through because they keep eroding each other. So each successive channel element follows a different path. There's significant cross-cutting of channels, and you preferentially preserve the axial facies. This is what a typical disorganized channel pattern might look like. So just to summarize, the organized versus disorganized, the organized has this beautiful textbook appearance. The disorganized, much more chaotic, and only pieces of channels are preserved. The good news with this one, the disorganized pattern, is they're usually fairly blocky and better communication. There's a typically higher net to gross. When you look at the organized pattern, it's often characterized by this fining upward pattern as opposed to more blocky, and the axial facies are not so well preserved.
Ya. Masih ada suara ya?
Hello? Okay, somebody needs to mute. Okay, so now lastly, we're going to look at fans, at what happens at the distal limits of the turbidite system. So this is what in cartoon form, the distal limits might look like. There's our feeder with multiple channels constrained by a valley, occasional crevasse splays, opening up into this network of smaller channels, getting progressively smaller, and finally opening up into almost a sheet out here. So if you look at a cross section over here, we've got amalgamation of channels inside the master container. If we look at a cross section here, the channels now are spreading apart, but there's also sand in between the channels. You come out here, the channels are getting smaller, more widely separated. You come out here, now it's as much sand in the overbank as there is in these small channels. And finally out here, it's almost sheet-like in its deposition with very small channels. And what's interesting also, as you come to the end of the system, the flow, of course, is decelerating. And when the flow decelerates, turbulence diminishes. So you may have an alternation of turbulent and laminar flow. That results in deposition of turbidites and actually mass flow deposits, which are not as well sorted. So you get well sorted alternating with poorly sorted. These what we call linked debrites or hybrid event beds. As you get near the fringes, the reservoir quality diminishes, even though if you drilled there, you'd see a nice blocky sand. Also, the dimensions of your muddy layers, there are few, so the muddy layers are more continuous out here, separating the sands. But again, that's a level of detail for another time. So what do they look like? Very typically, you've got this feeder system, transition point right there, opening up into a fan characterized by numerous small channels that had frequently shifted or avulsed. Here's another example, a feeder coming in here, spraying out like a garden hose that's spraying out channels in all directions. And here, another example. You get this feeder channel system and opens up into this fan of progressively smaller channels. So looking at that in more detail, you can see this channel coming in here and then opening up into a series of smaller channels. And you look at this and you can sort of see the channels. Let's blow that up. You can see the channels and there's a hint of channels in here, but it's hard to recognize specific channels. They're pretty much below detectability, below resolution. Now we can play with these images to enhance the appearance In this case, I took this image into Photoshop, and here you can see multiple different displays of the same image. And each of these gives us a little bit of insight as to the reservoir distribution. It creates a picture in our minds that we can then leverage to predict lithology, predict compartmentalization, understand how secondary recovery techniques might, how water flooding might affect something like this. So what we see seismically very often also in the section view is we see this couplet where early low stand is characterized by this more sheet-like fan deposit that you see here in the background, and late low stand, we see a single channel coming all the way across. It's a pattern that we see over and over again, suggesting that early low stand is a more sand-dominated time, and you open up into a fan. Late low stand, you get more mud in the system, and the levee channel makes its way farther out into the basin. So this is early low stand with numerous small channels. Late low stand, right over the top of that, a single channel complex. Again here, early low stand that you can see here, late low stand, a single channel going over the top. And in cross section, right here, this is a cross section right through the middle. You can see the early low stand and the late low stand. Now, we call these terminal splays. You can call them submarine fans. You can call them frontal splays. It's just words. This is the picture you need to remember. And looking at it more closely, you can see how the channels keep splitting up into smaller and smaller channels until finally we really can't recognize discrete channels anymore. Again, another example here, you can see all of these channels. There's just many, many channels. In this one, again, progressively smaller channels as they split up. This splitting up, we call that avulsion. Now, sometimes seismic data quality is not that good, and all we see is a single feeder opening up into this broad area here. However, having learned from images like this and the one on the previous page, on the previous slide, we know now how to best populate that feature. So here we've got two turbidite systems. You can see one here, one there. And in both instances, we've got a transition point from feeder to fan. We cannot recognize any individual channels in here. However, we know from examples like this that when we see this large area here, it's probably characterized by many small channels. In this example, we can see the prograding system. This is deep water, but not very deep water, as it turns out. The water depth that this was deposited in was probably only about 200 or 300 meters. But it doesn't matter. It's the same process. Those are the prograding system, and this is sitting right at the base. And you can see where it sits within this progradational succession. And when you look in detail, we can see these weakly confined channels frequently breaking out and avulsing. And off to the side here is a really nice example of a crevasse splay. We cannot see the crevasse itself, but it's probably right there. And then this opens up into a fan, but it's off to the side. So this we would call a crevasse splay, which is really just a failed avulsion. So an avulsion means a permanent shift to here of the whole flow. In this case, it was probably just a minor event that broke out, and then the flows kept going, and this was abandoned. So again, you see an image like that. So the details are not visible within this terminal fan, but we can populate it with what we know from other places and say, yeah, that's probably what's happening inside. Again, we got early low stand. We've got a system coming in here, builds a beautiful fan. Over the top, we got a single channel. Early low stand, late low stand. And if we look at a series of profiles, we can see starting with number 9, where we've got just a concentration of channels right in there. This is overbank or levee, not sand prone. This is sand rich. And as you come farther down from 9 to 10, we still have levee and we still have levee. But by the time you get to 12, it's really starting to open up. And this is all fan right in here. Multiple small channels. But as I mentioned earlier, we can see these channels so clearly in this image. Here in the cross section, we're kind of just guessing, and you know, we see suggestions of channels all through here, but our ability to understand the paleogeography is much greater with these map view images. So some more examples of turbidite fans. Look at all of these channels. You can't, you look at this really closely and you can see all the channels, but they're not as obvious. But if you were to drill here or here or here, probably you'd find sand in each place and you'd be thinking this is a sheet, when in reality it's really a cluster of channels. And again here. So in this example, we've got a system coming along. There's the feeder system. There's the transition point, and it opens up into a fan right here. Notice the sinuosity of these channels here, and these channels in here are much straighter. So when we look at these channels here, they're significantly straighter than what you have back in there. And that's the fan. So lastly, crevasse splays. And as I said, a crevasse splay is like a failed avulsion. In other words, it broke through, the flow came through the gap or the crevasse, and then later on, some of the flow escaped out here through the crevasse and opened up in here, but the entire flow eventually just kept, it resumed going this way. But you can see the crevasse splay here and here. And this is a very, it looks just like a terminal splay. And here's another big crevasse splay. You can see the main channel coming down, nice organized pattern. And it broke out, there's the gap, the crevasse right there. And it quickly opens up into this big fan, this crevasse splay. And is it sandy? Well, you look at a profile through here, and you can see the bump right there. When you see a bump, that's telling you that's a sandy fill right there. And if we look at another profile over here, now we've got 2 channels. Each one is characterized by a bump. So we know at least this part is sand rich, and therefore by extension, this is a sand rich fan system. Now, occasionally we get, not occasionally, but where the flow is unable to break through the levee, sometimes it goes over the top. And that's what happened in this case. This is from the Mikasa Strait, and we can see this is the basin floor, and we can see this channel coming down through here. And this is the path it took. And when it came down through here, every time the flow came around the bend, some of the flow came over the top, not through, but over the top. So this is not a sand, this scenario does not favor sand deposition in the overbank, but rather it favors the creation of sediment waves on the outer bend of these systems. So if you look at a dip magnitude map, the dip magnitude map enhances these sediment waves, and you can see how clusters of them form on the outer bends. Every time the flow comes around the bend, the upper part of the flow, as this cartoon illustrates, keeps going. Again, the flow comes around this bend, and the upper part of the flow keeps going, producing these sediment waves. But remember, if you're accessing only the upper part of the flow, that's not a very sandy part of the system. So these sediment waves tend to be very muddy. In contrast with if you break through the levee, Now you're accessing the deeper part of the turbidity current, and those will produce crevasse splays that are sand rich. So in conclusion, then, the a sea level cycle might look like this, with a low stand interval here. As sea level begins, just before sea level falls, like high stand time, like we have today, we're getting condensed section sedimentation, just very slow, very fine-grained sedimentation. Then as sea level begins to fall, the upper slope begins to become unstable because you're lowering sea level. And by lowering sea level, you're also lowering wave base. So you're starting to impact the seafloor even before sediment arrives from rivers. And now is where you may get a mass transport or slope failure occurring. Then eventually you get to this lowest point, and now you're delivering sediment from the rivers to the shelf edge and into the deep water. And this is a relatively sand-rich time. Then as sea level comes back, we're now trapping more of the sand on the incised valleys on the shelf, and now you're getting relatively lower sand to mud ratios, and now levee channels tend to dominate. And eventually, as sea level really begins to come back, and this is the interval that the shoreline is located near the shelf edge, as sea level comes back now, the upper slope re-stabilizes, and again we get mass transport, and finally condensed section. So what does it look like in a typical profile? This would be early. The first hint that we're approaching a low stand is we're getting these big mass transport deposits. Then we get the sand-rich terminal or splays or frontal splays. Then we get the more mud-rich levee channel. And finally, we get the overlying debris flow deposits. So that makes up the full cycle. Are you going to see the full cycle everywhere? Of course not. You will never probably see all four of these components in one place unless you're very lucky. So in this example, we've got condensed section at the base. We've got a frontal splay or fan down here. And finally, at the end, you're getting this final low sand content levee channel across the top. So to summarize, and this is the last slide. So your best-in-class lithologic prediction involves combining seismic interpretation with sequence stratigraphy and a sound knowledge of geologic first principles. There are two steps the interpreter has. First, to find the patterns that are geologically significant, and second, to populate those patterns with appropriate lithology. And then you've got a useful tool that helps you manage risk when it comes to exploration and development. So that's the end of my talk. And now I'm more than happy to answer questions if you have any.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Henry. It's such an amazing and really fruitful, maybe discussion later on. So we discussed already, and many things get clarity on the seismic interpretation and sequence stratigraphy. Maybe Mas Ricky, you can read how many questions at the chat box?
We already have 6 questions already.
Okay, I can see
the name. Yeah. Okay. We will turn on the audio. We will let people to turn on their audio for the question. The first question from Haris. Mr. Haris, you can turn on your audio for the question. You can.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Hi, Henry. Thank you very much for a very great and interesting presentation. We really appreciate this your time. So it's nice to meet you again virtually. I think last time we met during my time in Chevron, Indonesia, almost like 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. So my question, I'd like to ask if there's any specific geomorphological features that could differentiate between the sand-rich turbidite fan with the calcite turbidite. I know from your presentation that knowing the context is really play important roles. in building the geological interpretation. However, is there any, I mean, based on your experience, is there any specific geomorphological features that could differentiate between those two? That's all. Thanks.
Okay, so so it's a good question. So first of all, as you say, context is critical, and for context, what I would do first is to look at what's happening up on the slope, actually in the shallow water. What's the provenance look like? Is there a big carbonate factory? Is it a clastic setting? If I see no carbonates on the platform, then of course calciturbidites are not a reasonable interpretation. However, if there are carbonates up on the platform, then then we have to start thinking about the possibility of calcareous turbidites or calcite-rich turbidites or calciturbidites. In general, calciturbidites are much more rare than siliciclastic turbidites, partly because carbonates tend to cement up rather quickly, and to get a good turbidite, you need the grains to be disaggregated. And there's a tendency for carbonates to cement pretty quickly. So when there's shelf collapse of a carbonate setting, you get big clasts. You get more so it behaves. The product is more often a debris flow than a turbidity current. So let's say I can't determine the provenance, and I'm sitting in a deep water setting, and I want to see, is this a calciturbidite, calcareous rich, or is it siliciclastic? One of the things I would do would be look at the seismic velocities. Of course, if it's calcareous, if it's calcite or limestone, it's going to be pretty fast. If it's siliciclastic, it's usually a lot slower. So the velocities can help me out there to help me differentiate. But at the end of the day, clastics are clastics, whether they're bioclastics or siliciclastics, they're following the same rules. They're still going to behave and produce the same geomorphology. So the geomorphology is not going to allow me to necessarily distinguish between a calcite-rich or calcareous turbidite and a quartz-rich or siliciclastic turbidite, because clastics are clastics. They follow the same rules. So context will help. Seismic velocity will help. The relative rarity of calciturbidites is also going to help. It's going to tell me if I'm going to make an interpretation of calciturbidites, I better have a good reason, because otherwise they tend to be relatively unusual. Hope that helps.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Henry.
Okay, thank you very much. We will move to the next question from Wibi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Henry. Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Yep. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I just have one statement and then one question.
Sure.
I think there are some other attributes as well that we can use to show or display channel system turbidites or other geological features, which is spectral decomposition that is lately a lot used by seismic interpreters. But it's just a tool. I think the knowledge behind it is much more important. My question is actually...
In fact, spec decomp was one of the workflows I had on that list.
That's right.
It's a very useful one. Yeah, go ahead.
And the question is actually, my question is actually very similar to the previous question. So I just want to top that. What if you're exploring an area that the geology, with this is an exploration context, so you actually don't have many wells to prove the concept. And then let's say you have some contribution of calcareous sediments that would create this turbidite, or more like debris system. How is it, or what kind of cementation it would create in the system? For example, is it more cemented up dip in the channels or in the feeders, or you would find more cement in the deeper system, in the fans, for example? And would you still see characteristics of sandy system, for example, differential compaction? Yeah, that's probably the question I have. Thank you.
Yeah, so again, I've seen instances where you're in a slope valley, so you're in the feeder system, or even on the basin floor, if you're still in a constrained valley setting or basin floor valley setting. I've seen instances where there are, you look at a well log through there, or a core, and there are discrete sections that are calcareous, that are limestone, that came down most often as debris flows inside the channel. Even though the channel is dominated by siliciclastic, there are parts that are cemented, that are calcite rich. And it again goes back to how well do you know your provenance? How well do you know what the source of these sediments was up? Because it all comes from the outer platform, the outer shelf. So everything that you're looking at, well, most of what you're looking at came from up there. And if there's a carbonate factory available to you, then you start thinking, well, some of that stuff may opportunistically follow the same path as the siliciclastics followed. Now, the question that you raised was, do those calcareous rich deposits, what is the likelihood that they will travel as far out into the basin as the siliciclastics? So that the question would be, would you expect calcite cemented turbidite fan deposits far out where you've opened up into a lobe? And there you can only speculate. And of course, that's what they pay us to do. We're good at speculating. So let me speculate and say that when I've seen calcite cemented deposits within a turbidite setting, most of the time I've seen them in that middle region of the feeder systems, much less so on the outer fringes or in the fan itself. And that's just anecdotal. That's not systematic. That I've made that observation. I've seen it. I've seen occasionally cemented material pretty far out, where you've got marls that came down as gravity flows, fine-grained gravity flows, that were probably that were turbidites. But more commonly, it's problematic if it's a mixed siliciclastic carbonate system. More commonly, the calcite cement issue is not so much on the fan part, but back up into the valley system. But beyond that, it's case by case. And there's no real general rule. As I said, what I would look for, if it's looking at it as an end member scenario, where it's either all carbonates or all clastics in your turbidites, I'd look at the acoustic properties, the seismic properties. Is it fast? Is it slow? Are we seeing when you look at the top of a turbidite package, is it characterized by a positive impedance contrast or a negative one? Is it a strong positive? That's kind of what I would look for to get a handle on that aspect of risk. And of course, I'd really want to understand the provenance as best I could to see if, in fact, there's I don't want to use the word reservoir, but if there's a source of carbonates that could have been part of what came down those systems. So it's not an easy answer, and it's more case by case. It's almost almost like you have to look at each one and and develop your understanding for that area, because it is a tricky question. But as I say, when I'm down in the distributive part, on the fan part of the system, the incidence of getting a carbonate dominated lithology is low. So at least in terms of likelihood, it's less likely. Is it impossible? Of course not. Nothing's impossible in this world.
Maybe just one more. Do you have any analog to that?
Of carbonates in the system?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do actually, but not in the fan part. I've seen carbonates as part in offshore Brazil and also offshore West Africa, where you drill, you think you've got this nice siliciclastic package in the slope valley, and right in the middle of it, there's a 5 or 10 meters of carbonates, and it's pretty clear that you're looking at either a debris flow or in fact a calciturbidite, but more likely it's a debris flow that came down. And I say that because, again, the carbonates tend to cement up rather quickly. So if they do show up as part of a gravity flow, it's because the platform margin collapsed, and because it's cemented so early, it doesn't readily disaggregate into the grains. It stays as bigger clasts.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Next question is from Arga. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Henry. I immediately wrote my name when you show us one of the slides that is showing a Photoshop seismic plan view to enhance the visual for these channels. So apparently those approaches are similar to the spec decom, where we try to segregate these images into ranges of frequencies, and then we try to apply them in the RGB channels and then blend them. So my question is, the first question is it an acceptable industry standard to process these images through the Photoshop? Because I can understand that it's actually quicker when you already have a time view of the sections that you were looking for. And then the second question is, I saw the fans that were shown in the relatively low resolution amplitude in one of your plan views. And then you suggest to populate the channels for that specific area. My questions for the second part is, what's the best approach to populate those distributed channels in the seismic geomorphology? Thank you.
Okay, so first the comment about spectral decomposition. It is a very useful technique, for sure. But I have I have examples where there's insights to be gained from the spec decomp, but when you look at the original full amplitude, there are other things that you see that you don't see with the spec decomp. So there's value to looking at both. I would, with spec decomp, what you're doing, for those of you who are maybe not familiar with it, is you're looking at basically separating your volume by frequency. So you're looking at the high frequencies, the mid frequencies, and the low frequencies, and then you co-render these images. And again, it's all about patterns. So half the trick is getting the patterns to be obvious, the next part, and that gets to your next question, is populating those patterns correctly. And in order to populate those patterns correctly, you need to be knowledgeable geologically. So when it comes to those fan systems that you were just looking at, that I was just showing towards the end of my presentation, where you had many, many small channels, there's interpretation and then there's inferences. So we interpret the pattern as a fan. We infer the lithology. So inferring is like guessing, but an educated guess. So when we're out in a fan setting, what we're seeing the result of is a system that's frequently jumping, where the channel was active here, then it's here, or sometimes it's splitting. And what causes that is somewhat similar to, in river systems, a braided channel system, where the channel is constantly shifting to a new location. Well, they're shifting to a new location we call avulsion. And the reason it's shifting to a new location so quickly is it keeps filling its own channel and then forcing itself into a new location. And so, based on geologic first principles, is how I would populate those pictures. And I would say that the individual channel threads, they're multiple small channels. So it's a very high net to gross within that section. And it has good lateral continuity. You get sand in the channel, and you get sand in the very subtle overbank from each of these channels. So again, it's on a case-by-case basis. And you also asked about whether Photoshop is part of the workflow, and I see Photoshop as a way of manipulating images that can be very useful, particularly in terms of helping illuminate, helping us see things that we may not have seen with the simple amplitude map. If I show you that picture, let me go back to the Photoshop example. See if I can find it quickly. Let's see. That's the danger of having too many slides. Let's see, it's coming up. There we go. This one here. Let me move this out of the way. Okay, so this was the original picture. And yeah, you can see all the channels. Let me blow that up a little bit. Where's my magnifying glass? I've lost it. That's unusual. It's usually, oh, there it is. So you can see there's a lot of small channels. But look what happens when you look at it with, this is one of the image, it's one of the tools in Photoshop that you can apply. And now you can see all of these channels so clearly. Here, kind of see them, you see a lot of them. Here, it's really obvious. It's the same image, but now it's been modified with Photoshop. And then you come down here, and again, through the magic of Photoshop, you can see it's highlighting these areas. It's almost as if you've identified the most sand-rich areas, and especially here. Notice this. I would use these images to identify where my best sands are, where maybe not so good in between. So again, these are inferences. These are educated guesses that are reasonable from a geologic first principles perspective. It's reasonable to say that, yeah, the sand in here might not be as good as the sand over here. So this really does a very nice job of highlighting where the most sand-rich areas are. And there's no magic to this. It's just in Photoshop. So it's a very useful tool. I don't think we use it enough. You know, you can see here very nicely the channel pattern. And I think what it also helps with is when you're communicating with your managers and you're trying to make a case and you're trying to describe that, you know, you're telling him, well, there's a lot of channels in here. And he'll look at this and say, yeah, I see that one, I see that one, I see that one. But this area here and here, yeah, maybe not so much. Then you look at this treatment of the image and wow, there's no question. You've got lots of channels in there. So there's value to using Photoshop. Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. And I kind of agree with you, especially with the usage of this visual manipulation software, because at the end of the day, when we try to see the patterns, visual cue is what we were looking for. And the examples that we were seeing in the screen right now, that looks like the seismic relief. It's an attribute of the seismic relief. It's actually manipulations through the RGB channels in the Photoshop. So next time I'll do a project, I'll say Henry Posamentier, the top man in the stratigraphy, is actually using Photoshop. So I will be confident in that in front of our manager. Thank you.
Very good, very good. And yeah, so I hope Adobe Photoshop appreciates the business I'm giving them.
Okay, thank you. We can move to the next question, yeah, from Pak Ben Sapii. Yeah, from Ben Sapii, you can turn on your audio.
Hi, Henry.
Hi, how are you?
How are you? Fine, fine. How about you?
Yeah, it's been a long time.
Yeah, I just to sing. Actually, I want to say hello to you, and it's great. It's a pleasure to see you, and then it's a great lecture, so I enjoy it. Second part, I work a lot with the delta types of deep water type deposit like Tarakan or Mahakam or other places in Eastern Indonesia. And then I would like to ask you about your experience in the term of morphology and also exploration in the deep water part is the deformation part of the story. The soft deformation that accompany couples of the deep deposits. We see. Usually we are when our school in our crop we see some slums deposit, for instance. That's the largest one. There's the largest type of this type of deformation involving deep water sediments. It is sometimes look like a fault thrust belt in the term of morphology, meaning large scale type of deformations. Do you have experience looking of this type of characters in your experience? Thank you.
Are you talking about post-depositional deformation or syn-depositional?
Syn-deformation and deposition.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you see it, of course, there's a lot of many outcrop examples, but if I see a lot of syn-depositional deformation, it's usually because I'm in either a structurally active setting, tectonically active setting, or I'm in a slope environment. Because what the syn-depositional deformation implies is you've got unstable slopes. Somehow you're creating them. Either it's because you're on a continental slope setting, or you're on a rising structure. And that's what creates the deformation. And on seismic data, there are examples that I've captured and documented. If we had more time, I could share with you of syn-depositional slope failure associated with rising salt or fold structures that are interbedded with turbidites. So you get for example, you get a structure that's rising. You get turbidites coming around that structure, but the structure itself is shedding material that interbeds with the turbidites. So yeah, it's not uncommon.
So a growth structure is also part of the story in the deposition in the turbidite system?
It can be. It can be. The growing structure typically is not a good supply of sediment for the turbidites. If your structure is growing in the slope or even on the basin floor, and it starts shedding material, that material typically is not very sand rich. So we're not contributing to the sand content of your turbidite deposits. But having said that, you're still contributing to the overall section with sediments that are coming from the sides. But they're typically not sand rich. They're from an exploration and development perspective, those are the types of deposits that would be baffles or barriers to fluid flow.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Good to hear from you again.
Yeah, it'd be nice to see you again.
Okay, thank you, Henry. Should we continue the questions, or we can end the question session, sir? Because there are 6 more people want to ask a question. It's up to you. It's up to you.
We can continue. I'm fine.
Oh, okay.
We can proceed, Mas Ricky.
Yeah, Melinda?
Question, we can proceed.
We can proceed,
Yeah.
okay. Next question from Aryo, yeah.
Okay.
Henry, thank you very much for the talk. It's really great. I have 2 questions in here. First is, you show us in your presentation that we have 2 kind of channel in here, which is the organized and disorganized. Just curious, what kind of the subsurface condition or factors that will generate that each type of the channel there? And then the second is, sorry if it is a bit out of topic, but if we, for example, we don't have a good seismic quality where we cannot see the geomorphology of this turbidite channel feature, but we have the core data. So what sedimentological feature that will characterize the slope channel and what you call the terminal splay or maybe channel lobes transition? Because I believe in the terminal splay, we still have the channel type of turbidite sediment where we can see maybe like high density and class there. So what will different between that both type of morphology? Thank you.
Okay, so first question, what are the controls on organized versus disorganized? So the first order control is, are the flows, so to get an organized channel pattern, the key is after the flow is finished, is there still leftover channel? In other words, have you completely filled that channel or not? So in general, high energy flows that are not very sand rich will result in a more organized pattern, because the high energy flow will be capable of carving out a channel, but not capable of filling it. So that's the key, is are you able to, have you filled that channel at the end of each flow? So when we have the disorganized pattern, the flows apparently were efficiently filling their own channel. So now, to recognize this in the absence of good seismic data, typically the organized pattern, because it's gradually filling and then shifting, and the organized pattern, and because it's not completely filling its own channel, is the organized pattern is commonly characterized by a sharp base and then nice fining upward, blocky to fining upward. The disorganized pattern, because it's filling all the way up to the top, is more commonly characterized by a log pattern that's characterized by blocky at the base and almost blocky at the top as well. So in the absence of good seismic data quality, the log character, the gamma ray pattern, may give you an indication of whether you're dealing with an organized or disorganized pattern. And that in turn helps you to develop scenarios for field development, because the architecture is going to be very different. So now, what about if you have bad data? And what can we, bad data is bad data. What can we look at in the core that can tell us we're in a channel system, we're on the basin floor, we're far out on the, we're in the fan. So what can tell us whether we're in the feeder or the fan? Well, in the feeder system, you typically don't get good preservation of all the components of all the Bauma parts, the A, B, C, and D, and E. Typically, it's dominated by Bauma A and B, and some C. In other words, because each flow is coming down and is constrained in a valley setting, the flows tend to chop off the tops of the previous flows. So there's more amalgamation in the feeder systems than there is out on the fan, where there's more freedom to spread out. So when I see better preservation of the finer grained parts of a turbidite deposit, and not as much scour, as the fact that you're preserving the upper parts of the waning flow is telling me probably we're in a system where the garden hose is spreading from place to place, and so if you're out here, referring back to this image, or over here, if you're out here, you're probably not going to get one turbidite right on top of another, so that you have all of these amalgamated deposits. So I would use the core that way to try to evaluate and try to reconstruct the paleogeography. It's not a perfect science, because we basically have an outcrop that's 10 centimeters wide, and it's really tough to characterize the whole paleogeography on the basis of a 10 centimeter wide outcrop, but we do what we can. So if I see a lot of amalgamation where it's Bauma A, B, and then again Bauma A, B, and then again massive to planar bedded, again truncated, massive, then I'm thinking maybe I'm still in the feeder system, or close to the apex of a fan potentially. And there's not much more you can do. You can also, even where the data quality is not great, you may still be able to use the reflection architecture to tell you're in a confined setting. If you can see very discrete onlapping reflections with defining a channel morphology, even if you can't image channels directly, it's telling you something. Hope that helps. It's not, again, like anything else, as they say, they say this about history. History never repeats itself, but it rhymes. Likewise, geologic systems never exactly repeat themselves, but they're awfully similar. And that's the strength and the weakness of analogs. Be careful.
Okay.
Thank you, Henry. That's really helpful.
Okay. Next question. I hope we still have time. From Renaldi Vivaris. Mr. Renaldi Vivaris, you can turn on your audio.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, Henry. My name is Renaldi Vivaris from ITV. Thank you for a very insightful presentation about deep water deposits related to low stand system. However, how would you distinguish these low stands related deposits from those related to headward eroding submarine canyons, which can as well happen during transgressive system? And in this case could be muddy and depends on whatever sediments deposited on the shelf margin. That's my question. Thank you.
It's a good question. When I make the statement that deep water systems are most active during low stand time, the emphasis is on most. There are some situations where deep water systems are active even during high stand time. For example, if you go to the coast of California and you look at some of the canyons, they extend all the way up into the shelf, so that the shore face deposits that are traveling along the coast encounter a canyon, and then they get pulled into the canyon. So you can get longshore drift that's feeding the upper canyon, and so you get sediment gravity flows even during high stand time. Look at the Congo Canyon. The Congo Canyon extends all the way across the shelf and actually across the shoreline and up into the river system. So the Congo River is feeding the head of the canyon today. So those systems are partially active today as during high stand time. Then you get systems where you get canyon development. Now we need to look at how do canyons develop. And I can show you examples where we get, so we talk about canyons and we talk about slope valleys and slope channels and gullies. Those are all variations on the same theme. Canyons are big. Slope gullies are very small. Well, I can show you examples where I've encountered canyons that develop in the middle of the slope. They don't make it all the way up. Those guys, it all comes back to, are they linked to a river system? Because they really depend on the river systems to supply coarse material. So if you've got a canyon, well, if you look at most canyons around the world, whether it's the Congo Canyon, Mississippi Canyon, you name it, they're almost every one of those, in a passive margin in particular, almost every one of those canyons has an associated big river system on the shelf. And so it's like a chicken and egg situation where the canyons are formed largely because the rivers have supplied a lot of sediment to the top of the slope, which makes the slope somewhat unstable there. So you get collapse, and that starts forming the canyon. You get this headward migration of the head of the canyon, and suddenly the river gets captured by its own canyon. Because, so the river is responsible initially for starting canyon formation, but once the canyon starts forming, the canyon captures the river. So in the example that I showed earlier of that shelf edge delta, it's no surprise there's a shelf edge delta right where you have that big slope channel or slope valley. So but if you have a canyon or a slope valley that does not connect, does not reach all the way to the shelf slope break, it's not going to, it won't have access to a sandy provenance. And that's the key. It has to somehow have access to a sandy provenance, whether it's the river delivered sediment or the shore face delivered sediment that gets moved down into the canyon. One way or another, if you have no sand entering that canyon because you're not accessing it, you're not going to get sandy turbidites. They'll all be muddy.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, next question from Andri.
Yeah.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you fine.
Okay, from the deep water model on your presentation that show morphology from shelf slope to basin floor, there's a different sediment geometry and architectural that we can observe, where in the slope you will see a channel-like geometry, and in the basin you will see some loop geometry. I would like to ask about the channel geometry that developed at the last stage of the low stand, Henry.
Okay.
After the late low stand, after the early low stand and the late low stand, there is a channel-like geometry, And is that also a factor of the morphological changing
Okay,
of the?
yeah, I think I know where you're going with this. You know, why do we change from an early low stand situation? In fact, I can use this picture here. You can see this picture, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's say this was early low stand and late low stand, and let me sketch on there. Let's use that. So late low stand, what happens is you get a single channel coming all the way across, and somewhere out in here, it opens up into a fan just like it did earlier. Why does that happen is the question. You know, what's causing that change? And the predominant reason for that change from a fan over here to a single channel coming across, the predominant driver for that is the change in the sand to mud ratio in the flow itself. So in the early stages of a low stand, the flows are sandier. In the late stages of the low stand, the flows are muddier. And when the flows are muddier, those flows, surprisingly, are able to go farther out into the basin. And the reason being is that with muddy flows, you're getting more levee construction. And so the flow can make it farther out because it's got now more confinement with these levees over the top. So it's all a matter of mud in the system. The more mud you have, the better the system is at building levees. If you have, it's always useful to look at extreme examples. Let's take an extremely sandy flow with virtually very, very little mud. Those systems will come down the slope and almost immediately open up into a fan because you need the mud to build the levees. If you have a very muddy flow, it's really good at building levees and it's going to shoot much farther out into the basin. So the explanation for why the early low stand is sandier is opening up. So I showed you that picture where early low stand might look like this with this big fan coming out like so. And late low stand, let me change the color. Late low stand goes clear across the top, much farther out, and builds a much smaller fan out here. It's because the late low stand is muddier. Now, late low stand time is characterized by muddier flows. And why is that? It all comes back to what's happening up on the outer shelf. Remember, late low stand is characterized by slowly rising sea level, and that affects the shelf edge by causing more sand to be trapped on along the river system and because it's now slowly aggregating on the shelf because sea level is now rising, and that affects the sediment grain size delivered down the slope and into the deep water. So it's all a function of grain size.
All right, Henry, it's clear. And I have a second question.
Yep.
From your very nice picture that you show in your presentation, and it is extracted from Seismic, I think it's much require a pretty good seismic data to produce a kind of good looking picture like that. But if you are dealing with the poor seismic data set and then like complex geology, more to sand prone area, what kind of visualization technique based on your experience that work best on that kind of situation, Henry?
Yeah, well, bad data is bad data. But when the examples, so we use examples like this. Let me find my cursor. Hang on. Let's go here. Visible. So when I look at places where data quality is not so good, I always have these pictures in my head. I know that even if I can't see the nice clear imagery of the turbidite system because data quality is not so good, I have a collection of pictures in my head that tell me that basically make up my catalog of possible interpretations. And I try to fit the correct analog into those areas that have poor quality data. So what do you do with poor quality data? What techniques? Well, there are, you know, as I showed you in the previous example, I showed you in the very beginning. Let's see right here. You know, there are many techniques to use: time slices, horizon slicing, creative datuming, and sometimes you know, spectral decomp, optical stack coherence, seismic facies, curvature. You know, there's all kinds of ways to image features. Now, I was looking at this example right here. Let's go back here. Let me go here. This example right here is an example that I literally put together about an hour before the presentation, because I could see this feature right here, and I wanted to get a picture of the paleogeography. Now the quality is okay; it's not great, it's not perfect, but in this case, the first thing I tried was to do this creative datuming. And it gave me a reasonably good picture. Is it a perfect picture? No. But I can now take this image, and through my understanding of turbidite systems, I could probably give you a pretty good interpretation of that. You know, for example, it looks like we've got a meander, you know, the whole system, which is about 2 kilometers wide, consists of many smaller channel elements. And you can see how this has migrated. It looks like a meander loop here that's now here. This system was moving in this direction. The channel elements are probably about 200 or 300 meters wide. So that's what I would use to populate this picture, which is not very clear, but I've got enough hints in here that tell me, yeah, channel elements make up this system. I know it's relatively sand rich because I can see the bump over the top, and I can't see individual channels. My next step would be to come in here and actually seed every one of these amplitudes and see how they map. So each area requires creativity. Each area requires you to try this, to try that, try optical stack, try amplitude picking, specific amplitudes, see how they map out, if they map out. So each area is different, and bad data requires you to be even more creative. But keep in mind that even if you can't see them, those turbidite deposits are still following the same basic set of rules. They all follow bathymetric lows. They all if they're confined, they tend to amalgamate. The sands tend to amalgamate. If there's overbanking, we tend to see rapid sedimentation out of suspension, producing climbing current ripples. So we can look at sedimentary structures to help determine where we are in a system if you're lucky enough to have core. So the short answer is it isn't easy, but you do what you can based on your experience, based on analogs, based on as many different workflows as you can throw at your data.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Henry. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the answer. We can move to the next question here from Krishna.
Okay.
Mr. Krishna, you can turn on your audio.
Yes, can you hear?
Yeah.
Yep, I hear you.
Good morning, Pak Henry, and thank you very much for the presentation. It's very good refreshment. And okay, straight to the end question. So I have some experience working in the deep water area in the North Makassar Strait. And actually, in the topography, we can see that in the northern area of, in the slope of Makassar Strait, that we can see large submarine canyons. And the question is, do you think that is it more indication of a starved sediment condition, or was it actually an indication of there was a big, very sandy turbidite flows that in the ancient, in the previous time was able to sculpt into that area and then dump straight into the basin floor? And that's the first question. But
okay. So
yeah,
let me answer that one before you get to the next question. So so when you see a canyon, and of course we have to be very careful that we're both creating the same picture in our minds when we say the word canyon. But let's say we have a canyon that's characterized by erosional walls. So what we can say is that there had to have been processes active that were of sufficient energy to create those canyon walls, or to create that deep erosion. And the dominant process to do that is the gravity flow process. Now, when we say gravity flow, it does not differentiate. Gravity flow is just a general term that includes both mass transport as well as turbidite. So just to see, when we see big erosional scour, it could be from a mass flow or collapse that does not necessarily mean that there's sand there. So you have to look very carefully at what's filling that canyon. And specifically, you look at canyons like the Mississippi Canyon. And when you look at Mississippi Canyon, and very carefully look for evidence for turbidite deposits in the canyon, you find turbidites in the canyon, but only right at the base. And yet, Mississippi Canyon is responsible for a huge dump of sand-rich material out on the lower slope and basin floor. Now look at canyons off West Africa. Those canyons have a lot of turbidite channels inside them, almost right to the top, here and there and there and there. Very different style of canyon filling, both of which are associated with active gravity flows, but the ones in West Africa are tend to be more sand-rich all the way through it. Mississippi Canyon has sand at the bottom and more collapse into the side of mass transport deposit. So the canyons in Makassar Strait, you have to look at them carefully to make sure, first of all, do the canyons extend all the way to the shelf edge, or are they mid-slope related to collapse? If they never reach, if they don't connect to the shelf edge, probably not a good source of sand. If they do connect to the shelf edge, then you've got potential. But I would look very carefully at the fill of that canyon before I make a prediction as to whether there are sands farther seaward related to that canyon. So your next question.
Thanks, Henry. So the next question, in the upper slope area, where we tend to have ponded basin clay types. So how can we be more convinced that there is actually a sediment gravity flow that were trapped in the piggyback basins from the sequence stratigraphy perspective? As if, how do you expect, is it going to be more channel features or fan features? And so, and also, sorry, sub question.
Yeah.
So if we see mud diapirs in the middle slope area, such as in Makassar Strait, do you expect the mud diapir to control the channel, or actually could the channel actually sculpt a mud diaphyr? And that's the end. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. So the first thing I want to convince myself of is at the level that I'm looking, were the mud diaphyrs active at that time? In other words, were the turbidites coming in after the structure was in place and the mini basins were already there, or did the turbidites come in before the mini basins formed? Let's say the mini basins were already there, meaning they're syn structural deposition. In other words, the turbidites are coming in, but there's already these mini basins, like in the Gulf of Mexico, like off West Africa, like offshore Brunei and Sarawak on the other side of Borneo. The turbidites, again, basic rule, they always follow the lows. So they'll always follow the bathymetric low there. And so when you have a mini basin, it's exactly like the basin floor in a sense. It's where the slope flattens out, and that's where the flows will slow down and potentially spread out. So it's possible to get fans inside these mini basins, just like on the basin floor much farther out. Again, turbidites follow some very basic laws, very basic rules. And if there's a mud diaphyr or a toe thrust or a salt structure, we don't care. The turbidites don't care what created the topography. If there's topography there, the turbidites will interact with it, and they will go around that structure. They will not. You're not going to get sand on top. You know that. So that the flows always follow around the lows, and that's how. And again, something to think about also, and this is especially true where you have salt involved, is the salt is kind of always moving up, and so the mini basins gradually fill during low stand time and heal up that mini basin. And then when sedimentation stops during high stand time, the salt continues to move, or in this case, the mud continues to move, and the basin essentially reforms by subsidence. And you can see that by the onlapping reflections of the early low stand that comes in after a period of non-deposition. So looking carefully at the stratigraphic architecture, you can see the result of periods of rapid sedimentation with onlap in these mini basins, looking at the section view, of course, with onlap, and then things go quiet and it's more drape, and then subsidence continues without any turbidites coming in. You develop a mini basin again, and the first time sediment comes back in during the next low stand, again, onlapping inside that mini basin. So again, it's there's no black and white answer to your question. It's always on a case-by-case basis. But if you understand the rules that turbidites live by, you can then make more educated predictions.
All right, many thanks, Pak Henry.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All the best.
Thank you very much, Pak. There is 2 more questions. Next question is from Pak Wayan. Pak Wayan, you can turn on your audio, Pak.
Okay. Hi, Henry. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Yeah, fine. It's been 20 years, maybe since ARCO time.
It has been. Are you in Bali?
Yeah, sort of. No, I want to be in Bali, but I'm still here.
Okay.
Jakarta.
And your hair is much lighter, but at least you have some.
Yeah, maybe. I remember how you like the whole grilled chicken. Yeah,
that's true.
And running.
That's true.
Yeah. You always inspiring me. David, you are the best mentor when I was in ARCO, and even since then, even when we don't, we communicate via your products, your books, and that kind of thing. So I learned a lot. Thank you very much. And some of the phrase that I like is your phrase about the absence of evidence is not evidence for absence. I remember that. That's very useful. And another one is FLT, funny looking things. Now I'm working on production optimization of 2 fields in Berantas block. Maybe you remember the Wunut and Tanggulangin. It's a Pleistocene volcanic lastics reservoir. So it used to be regarded as several sequences of delta, pluviodeltaic sequences. But when I look at the lower part of the section, I remember about your term of FLT. Oh, this is too funny for delta. And I start digging because it's bump, yeah? Looks like a channel, a submarine channel levee complex. And I look at the paleontology bed and I found it's not very deep, but it's alterneritic to apobathial, something like that. And then we start doing correlation and isopac. I had a very good stratigrapher. This is 2D. He is Alauddin Alan Gantino. So maybe, so we found trend. The lower part where it is blocky sand in gamma ray. The isopac shows several lobes. So that's what we interpret as a lower low stand braided or sand-rich fan, and followed by this channel levee complex above it. And after that, yes, we see prograding pluviodeltaic sequence above it. So my first question actually about the upper or late low stand channel levee complex, which already been answered by your diagram before. I was going to ask whether this channel levee complex will have lobes in down deep, because if we're going to be drilling this, we are drilling this now, and maybe in 1 week we will intersect that, but not at the anomaly, but the anomaly we will drill next month. So my question is whether down deep from this channel levee complex we have terminal lobe. Yes, you answered that already. So that raised my second question. Whether we can expect sand in the channel, because it's never been drilled. What has been drilled by 20 wells are on the flank, on the levee, and some of the, maybe 1/3 of the, maybe 6 to 8 wells intersect what I call overbank crevasse channel or crevasse splay. They good sand, good rate, but they decline very fast because the lateral extent is not that great. Yeah? So if we have a levee with good sand, although it's a very narrow channel or whatever, can we expect inside the channel levee complex, inside the channel, main channel, enrich?
Well, yeah, as you can imagine, it's not, again, it's never 100% certainty with any of this stuff, but if you look at a profile like this, and you look at the levees on both sides, if you look at a map view, this is a typical, so this profile might be back here, right?
Yeah, this right.
Okay, and the farther you come out, the lower the levees. And if you go back here, the levees are a bit higher. So this would be here. This would be, whoops. Sorry, I missed that one. This would be here. And this one would be there.
Yeah.
So the levees are progressively lower as you come here, but they're also getting progressively sandier because back here, the flow is down here, and the sandy part of the flow really doesn't get up to there. So the top of the flow here is going to be really muddy. As you get lower in the system, the sandy part of the flow is getting closer and closer to the levee crest. So you're going to get progressively more sand in the levees down here, but the levees are going to be smaller. So right in here, again, they don't go very far. You very quickly run out of sand in the levee. So you're going to get sand just close in to here. Now, the question is there going to be sand in the channel itself? In the least, you will almost always find a lag deposit in the channel. Almost always, you're going to find, if you find sand here, there will be sand there.
Yeah.
Because what you're seeing here is sand from the upper part of the flow. So if there's sand in the upper part of the flow, there's certainly sand in the lower part of the flow.
Mm.
So if you've got wells that go through here and you're pretty convinced this is levee deposit, then it says you must have sand in the base of the channel too.
Okay.
So that's kind of the way I would look at it.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really appreciated. Yeah, encouraging.
Well, good luck.
Yeah, maybe I can send you some of the pictures. So
I'd love to.
It's 2D, 1 to 2 kilometers. But so we scratch our head, very imaginative, try to interpret where the channel is going to go. Yeah.
Yeah, let me give you my email. In fact, if as you encounter, and any of you, if you see interesting features that you want some feedback on, I'd be happy to help out. Let me give you my email address, and let me go back and put it over here. So that's my email address right there.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Henry.
Okay, good to see you again.
Yeah, maybe we can have a great chicken again sometime.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
All right. Cheers.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Okay. We still have one last question from Mas Piki. Mas Piki, you can.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear my voice?
I sure can. Yep, I can.
Yeah. Thank you, Henry, for the presentation. So in your presentation, you showed to us that we can utilize the seismic geomorphology to identify the submarine channel geometry. And now I'm curious about the geometry the lobe that form at the end of the channel, the submarine lobes.
Okay.
Because in your presentation, I don't see any kind of submarine lobe at the end of the channel. So my question is, can we also use the seismic geomorphology to interpret or to identify the geometry of the submarine lobes?
Okay, well, remember that what seismic data is good at is recognizing sharp boundaries. So when I see, let me sketch on here. Let's go here. So if I have a channel in map view like this, that boundary and that boundary is easy to see because we've got sand in here and we got shale over here. If you look at a profile, we can see something like that. So it's easy, it's relatively straightforward because what seismic looks for are what we call impedance contrasts or sharp boundaries. Now, lobes are much more difficult to recognize as a result because lobes just kind of die out. You can see the channels coming here, and you can speculate that there's a lobe like that. and in individual lobes, perhaps like that. But because that's not a sharp boundary, and that's not a sharp boundary, it's a gradational boundary. Because they're gradational boundaries, they don't show up so easily on seismic data. So at best, what you might have, and let me go back. Okay, let me go back to this picture here. Let's go back to my Photoshop example here. So let's move this out of the way. So this is probably as good as it gets. And now this is just a Photoshopped image, but in the amplitude domain, you may be able to sketch. Let me do that here. Now let's go with red. So if I had an amplitude map that looked like this, I might be able to say, well, there are lobes here and here and here. It's hard to tell. What you're seeing here, that's a shadow from something higher up, so ignore that. But you can see, even on this one, there seems to be possibly a lobe here and a lobe here. The lobe limits are not sharp boundaries. So the result is they always look a little bit fuzzy on seismic data. And if the data quality is not good, you're not going to see that at all. So here you can speculate something like that. Does that mean that the sand ends over there? No. I think the sand probably continues, but below seismic resolution. These are not sharp pinch outs. So we can, if the data quality is good, if there's a good amplitude contrast between sand and mud, we might be able to sketch in the limits like I've shown here, but recognize that that's just the seismic limit. That's not the actual limit of the sand. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, that's what. Thank you very much, Henry, for the question, for the answer.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you very much. That will end our discussion. That is very, very excellent discussion, very excellent presentation also. On behalf of FOSI, we will like to thank you very much. We are very happy to have you, Henry. And I will give the time to Melinda to close this session. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Mas Ricky, and thank you to all participants. And of course, especially for you, Henry, thank you very much. 10:30 already in Houston. Very sorry for so many questions coming from the participants. And maybe that's all from me. The next FOSI talk will be talking about Makassar Strait, and then we will talking about the another deep water and the hazard as well. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you very much once again for joining this session. Thank you, Henry, and have a good rest. And keep safe and healthy in Houston.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, Henry. See you again.
Thank you, bye, Henry.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, Ian.
Melina.
Thank you all. Pamino.
Thank you, Panitia FOSI.
Ya. Terima kasih, Mas Krisna. Thank you.
Sama-sama.
Ya.
Welcome.
Sampai jumpa lagi. See you later.
Ya, sampai jumpa.
Take care ya. Stay healthy. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Mas Ricky, thank you. Aku live ya.
Ya, makasih banyak Melinda. Thank you.
Sama-sama.
Oke,
Terima kasih FOSI.
Iya,
Pak Wayan,
Pak
makasih.
Wayan.
Ya. Saya end meeting ya semuanya. Terima kasih.
Ada session lagi nggak sore ini? Nggak kan? Setelah ini?
Ada. Nanti saya kirim Pak via email Pak. Recordingnya sama PPT-nya. PPT-nya nanti saya minta dulu.
Ya.
Jadi kita minta dulu ya.
Ya, session berikutnya jam berapa?
Oh, session. Kalau FOSI session berikutnya nanti tanggal 30, Pak Wayan.
Itu ya, oke. Bukan
karena next week kita lebaran dulu, Pak, walaupun di rumah.
Hari ini berarti udah selesai ya.
Hari udah selesai, paling nanti siang ada SPWLA sih, Pak, itu ngomong tentang core. Ada core handling, tapi untuk FOSI nanti tanggal 30.
Ya,
Makassar Street.
Yusdian Nicholson.
Iya, terima kasih ya Melina. Terima kasih teman-teman.
Sama-sama Pak Wayan. Sehat selalu Pak.
Ya Widi, terima kasih Widi.
Thank you Mbak Mel, thank you Rizky.
Iya, sama-sama Mas.
Oke, saya end meeting ya semuanya.
Ya, oke Mas.
Oke, thank you.